Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Natchez history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1838, the Mississippi River carried more than muddy water and commerce through the port of Natchez. It carried secrets that would remain buried for over a century in the humid earth of Adams County. Among the grand mansions that crowned the bluffs overlooking the river, a mystery unfolded that would challenge everything the residents of this prosperous cotton town thought they knew about the boundaries between the worlds of master and slave. The Langford plantation, known as Meridian Hall, stretched across 2,000 acres of some of the most fertile land in the Mississippi Territory. Built in 1821 by tobacco merchant Jeremiah Langford, the estate represented the pinnacle of antebellum prosperity. The main house, a towering Greek revival structure with 6 white columns and wraparound galleries, could be seen from the river below. Behind it, a network of dependencies housed the kitchen, smokehouse, and quarters for the 143 enslaved people who worked the cotton fields. Jeremiah Langford had died in 1836, leaving the plantation to his only son, Cornelius Langford, a 28-year-old graduate of Princeton who had returned home reluctantly to manage the family's holdings. Cornelius possessed neither his father's business acumen nor his iron-fisted approach to plantation management. Neighbors often remarked that he seemed uncomfortable with the realities of his inheritance, preferring to spend his time in the estate's extensive library rather than overseeing field operations. The household staff at Meridian Hall included 26-year-old Mercy Langford, whose surname she had inherited not by choice, but by the brutal custom of the time. Born on the plantation in 1812, Mercy had been raised in the main house as a personal attendant to Jeremiah Langford's wife, Sarah, who had died of yellow fever in 1834. Mercy possessed an unusual education for an enslaved person, having learned to read and write by observing the Langford children's lessons from the shadows of doorways and beneath staircases. What made Mercy's situation particularly complex was her appearance. She had inherited light skin and refined features that suggested mixed ancestry, though plantation records maintained strict silence on such matters. In the rigid social hierarchy of Natchez society, such physical characteristics created an uncomfortable gray area that planters preferred not to acknowledge publicly. The mystery began in earnest during the winter of 1837, when a series of unexplained events started occurring at Meridian Hall. Cornelius Langford's personal papers, discovered much later in 1864 during the Union occupation of Natchez, contained references to unusual domestic arrangements and complications requiring discretion. These cryptic notes would prove to be the first documented evidence of what was happening within the plantation's walls. According to the testimony of elderly house slaves interviewed by Union officers in 1864, Mercy had begun spending increasing amounts of time in the main house's upper floors, particularly in the master's private study. Other enslaved people noticed that she had been given privileges typically reserved for free servants, access to better clothing, exemption from field work, and the unusual freedom to move about the house without supervision. The first external witness to notice something irregular was Dr. Samuel Prescott, the plantation's physician, who made regular visits to attend to the health of both the Langford family and their human property. In a letter to his brother in Vicksburg, dated February 15, 1838, Dr. Prescott wrote, "Young Langford appears to have developed an unhealthy preoccupation with matters of household management. He spends excessive time discussing the welfare of individual servants, particularly one young woman whose condition requires, in his opinion, special attention." What Dr. Prescott had observed but could not openly acknowledge in polite society was the growing relationship between Cornelius and Mercy. In the brutal mathematics of slavery, such relationships were not uncommon, but they typically followed predictable patterns of exploitation and abuse. What was happening at Meridian Hall appeared to deviate from these grim norms in ways that made the white community deeply uncomfortable. The Reverend Elijah Stockton, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Natchez, began receiving visits from concerned parishioners in the spring of 1838. Church records, preserved in the Adams County Historical Society, include notes about moral irregularities at Meridian Hall and unseemly behavior requiring pastoral intervention. However, Reverend Stockton's attempts to address the situation directly with Cornelius Langford were met with polite but firm dismissal. The social pressure intensified when Eleanor Whitman, widow of a prominent cotton factor and one of Natchez society's most influential matrons, organized what she termed interventions of Christian duty. Mrs. Whitman's diary, donated to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in 1952, provides a detailed account of the community's growing alarm about the situation at Meridian Hall. According to Mrs. Whitman's entries, Cornelius had been observed walking the plantation grounds with Mercy in broad daylight, engaging in conversations that appeared far too familiar for the accepted social order. More shocking still, Mercy had been seen wearing fine clothing and jewelry that could only have come from the master's family possessions. Such visible displays of favoritism threatened the careful balance of power that maintained the entire plantation system. The crisis reached a breaking point in June of 1838, when Mercy's pregnancy became impossible to conceal. In the antebellum South, pregnancies among enslaved women were typically managed as matters of property increase or agricultural planning. The father's identity was rarely discussed openly and certainly never recorded in official documents when it involved white men. However, the situation at Meridian Hall defied these conventions in dangerous ways. Dr. Prescott's medical records, found among his personal papers in 1947, indicate that he was called to examine Mercy on June 23, 1838. His notes describe a woman in excellent health receiving medical attention, typically reserved for white patients. More significantly, his records show that Cornelius Langford was present during the examination and actively participated in discussions about prenatal care, behavior that violated every social convention of the era. The neighboring plantation owners began to express their concerns more directly. James Morrison, who owned the adjacent Rosemount plantation, confronted Cornelius about what he termed dangerous precedents being set at Meridian Hall. Morrison's letter to his brother-in-law in New Orleans, dated July 4, 1838, described Cornelius as a man who has lost sight of the natural order, and warned that such behavior could inspire dangerous ideas among the slave population throughout the county. The situation became even more complex when it was discovered that Cornelius had been teaching Mercy to manage certain aspects of plantation business. Account books found in the estate's library showed entries in Mercy's handwriting, documenting cotton sales and supply purchases. For an enslaved person to possess such knowledge and authority represented a fundamental violation of the social and legal structures that governed antebellum Mississippi. As Mercy's pregnancy progressed, the pressure on Cornelius to resolve the situation intensified. Traditional solutions to such circumstances typically involved selling the enslaved woman to a distant plantation, thereby removing the evidence of inappropriate relationships. However, Cornelius appeared increasingly reluctant to pursue this course of action. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. The mystery deepened when Cornelius began making inquiries about legal procedures for manumission, the formal process of granting freedom to enslaved people. Court records from Adams County show that he consulted with attorney Benjamin Crawford about the requirements for such proceedings. These legal consultations were noted by court clerks and quickly became the subject of speculation throughout Natchez's white community. On August 15, 1838, Mercy gave birth to a son. Dr. Prescott's records indicate that the child possessed physical features that made his parentage unmistakable to anyone who observed both him and Cornelius. However, the baby's birth was not recorded in the plantation's official slave registry, an omission that would later prove significant. The weeks following the birth witnessed a series of events that would transform the situation from a local scandal into something approaching tragedy. Cornelius appeared to be making preparations for dramatic changes to his household arrangements. He had begun converting a section of the plantation's guest quarters into what appeared to be independent living space, complete with fine furnishings and books. Mrs. Whitman's diary entries from this period describe the white community's growing sense of crisis. She wrote, "The young Langford has lost all sense of propriety and Christian duty. His behavior threatens the very foundations upon which our society rests. If such arrangements are permitted to continue, what message does this send to our own people about the natural order that Providence has established?" The pressure reached its culmination when a delegation of prominent planters, led by Judge Robert Crawford, arrived at Meridian Hall on September 3, 1838, for what they termed a frank discussion of community standards. The meeting lasted several hours, and while no official record exists of what was discussed, the consequences became apparent within days. On September 7, 1838, Mercy and her infant son disappeared from Meridian Hall. The circumstances of their disappearance were never fully documented, but the aftermath was swift and decisive. Cornelius Langford was found dead in his study on September 9, 1838. Dr. Prescott's death certificate listed the cause as apoplexy, though his private notes suggested a more complex medical situation. The official investigation into both disappearances was brief and concluded that Mercy had likely fled north, taking advantage of the growing network of abolitionists operating along the Mississippi River. This explanation satisfied the legal requirements while avoiding the more troubling questions about what had actually transpired during those final days. However, the truth proved far more disturbing than the official account suggested. In 1963, during renovation work at Meridian Hall, construction workers discovered a sealed room beneath the main house's foundation. Inside this hidden chamber, they found the remains of a woman and infant, along with documents that cast an entirely new light on the events of 1838. The documents included letters written by Cornelius to his attorney, outlining his intention to free Mercy and formally acknowledge their son. More shocking still were papers indicating that Cornelius had drawn up a will that would have left the entire Meridian Hall estate to Mercy and their child, with provisions for their relocation to Pennsylvania, where such arrangements might be legally recognized. The letters revealed that Cornelius had been in correspondence with Quaker abolitionists in Philadelphia who had agreed to help establish Mercy and the child in a new life. The plan was to be implemented in October of 1838, but it was discovered by members of the white community before it could be carried out. The final document found in the hidden chamber was a confession, apparently written by Judge Crawford, acknowledging his role in what he termed the necessary correction of an intolerable situation. The confession, dated 1859, described how the delegation of planters had returned to Meridian Hall on the night of September 7th to prevent what they saw as a catastrophic threat to the social order. According to Crawford's account, the confrontation had escalated when Cornelius refused to abandon his plans and threatened to expose other plantation owners' relationships with enslaved women. The situation had spiraled beyond control, resulting in violence that the men then agreed to conceal through the fabricated story of Mercy's escape and Cornelius's natural death. The confession detailed how Mercy and her son had been killed and concealed beneath the house, while Cornelius was given what Crawford described as a choice between honor and exposure. The exact nature of Cornelius's death remained unclear, but Crawford's words suggested that the young planter had chosen to end his own life rather than live with the knowledge of what had been done to the woman and child he had tried to protect. The discovery of these documents in 1963 created a brief sensation in historical circles, but the story was quickly suppressed by families still prominent in Natchez society. The remains were quietly reinterred in an unmarked grave, and the documents were classified as restricted materials in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. The Meridian Hall plantation was sold to developers in 1965 and converted into a subdivision of modest homes. However, residents of the neighborhood have reported persistent problems with the property. Foundations crack without explanation, electrical systems fail regularly, and many families have moved away after brief residences, citing an oppressive atmosphere that they cannot adequately describe. The basement where the hidden chamber was discovered has been sealed with concrete, but construction workers occasionally report the smell of roses, a scent that has no apparent source. Mercy's favorite flowers, according to the testimony of surviving elderly residents, had been the white roses that grew wild along the plantation's fence lines. Local historians have attempted to research the case further, but many relevant documents remain missing or restricted. The Adams County Courthouse suffered a mysterious fire in 1967 that destroyed many records from the 1830s. Similarly, the First Presbyterian Church's historical archives were donated to an unknown private collector in 1968, making further investigation impossible. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a historian at the University of Southern Mississippi, attempted to write a comprehensive account of the Meridian Hall case in the 1980s, but her research was cut short when she was denied access to key materials. Her preliminary notes, found after her death in 1993, suggested that the events of 1838 were part of a larger pattern of violence used to maintain social control in the antebellum South. The few surviving descendants of families involved in the case have maintained silence about their ancestors' roles in these events. The Crawford family, now prominent in Jackson's business community, donated a large sum to the Mississippi Historical Society in 1975, with the stipulation that certain materials remain permanently sealed. Today, Meridian Hall exists only in photographs and property records. The grand house that once dominated the bluffs above Natchez was demolished in 1966, officially due to structural problems that made restoration impossible. However, workers reported that the building seemed to resist demolition efforts, with machinery repeatedly failing and accidents plaguing the project until it was finally completed. The subdivision built on the plantation grounds has struggled with persistently high turnover rates. Real estate agents avoid mentioning the property's history, but potential buyers often report feeling uncomfortable during house tours, particularly when viewing homes built near the former location of the main house. The case of Cornelius Langford Mercy and their unnamed son represents one of the few documented instances where the rigid social barriers of the antebellum South were challenged from within the planter class itself. However, it also demonstrates the brutal efficiency with which such challenges were suppressed when they threatened the economic and social foundations of the slave system. The story might have remained forever buried if not for the accidental discovery in 1963. Even then, the truth was quickly reconcealed, suggesting that the forces that silenced this family in 1838 retained their power well into the modern era. The fact that key documents remain restricted more than 50 years after their discovery indicates that some secrets are deemed too dangerous for public knowledge, even in a society that has officially rejected the values that created them. For the residents of modern Natchez, the Meridian Hall case serves as a reminder that the grand mansions and romantic legends of the antebellum South were built upon a foundation of violence and oppression that reached into every aspect of daily life. The beauty of the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River cannot erase the reality of what was done in the name of maintaining social order. The story also raises troubling questions about how many similar cases were successfully concealed without any trace remaining for future discovery. If the events at Meridian Hall could be hidden so effectively for over a century, how many other families disappeared without anyone to document their fate or seek justice for their deaths? Perhaps most disturbing of all is the realization that the conspiracy to conceal these murders involved some of Natchez's most respected citizens, including religious leaders, legal officials, and medical professionals. The case demonstrates how quickly a community can unite to protect its interests, regardless of the moral cost of such solidarity. The unnamed child who died with his mother represents one of the countless victims of a system that denied humanity to people based solely on their ancestry and legal status. His brief existence, documented only in his father's desperate letters, serves as a testament to the possibility of love and recognition even within the most oppressive circumstances. The tragedy of Meridian Hall also illustrates the impossible position faced by enslaved women who found themselves the objects of white men's attention. Whether such relationships began as mutual attraction or coercive exploitation, they invariably placed the women in mortal danger when they threatened the social order that white communities were prepared to defend with violence. Cornelius Langford's attempt to challenge the system from within ultimately cost him his life, but his willingness to risk everything for Mercy and their son provides a rare example of moral courage in a society built upon moral compromise. His plans to free his family and share his inheritance with them would have been revolutionary for their time and place. The sealed documents in the Mississippi archives continue to hold secrets that might shed additional light on this case and others like it. Until those materials are made available to researchers, the full truth about what happened at Meridian Hall will remain partially hidden. However, enough evidence exists to understand that this was not an isolated incident, but rather one example of a pattern of violence used to maintain white supremacy throughout the antebellum South. The modern residents of Natchez have largely forgotten the name Meridian Hall, and few know the location where the plantation once stood. The subdivision built on its grounds bears a generic name that gives no hint of its history. This erasure of memory serves the same function as the original concealment of the murders. It protects the community from confronting uncomfortable truths about its past. Yet the story persists in fragmentary form, passed down through whispered conversations and half-remembered family stories. Elderly residents sometimes speak of strange occurrences at houses built on certain lots in the subdivision. Children playing in yards occasionally report finding rusted metal objects that appear to be pieces of shackles or chains, physical remnants of the plantation's history that continue to surface despite efforts to bury them. The case of Meridian Hall demonstrates how the past continues to exert its influence on the present, even when official efforts have been made to erase all traces of traumatic events. The soil that once witnessed such violence cannot be completely cleansed by time or development, and the memories of such injustice persist in ways that transcend official records and public acknowledgement. For those who study the dark history of the antebellum South, the Meridian Hall case serves as a reminder that romantic narratives of plantation life cannot withstand close examination of the documentary evidence. Behind the facade of gracious living and noble traditions lay a system of exploitation and violence that touched every level of society. The fact that this story has been largely erased from public memory reflects the ongoing power of those who prefer to remember the antebellum period as a time of genteel tradition rather than systematic oppression. The continued restriction of key documents suggests that some truths are still considered too dangerous for general knowledge, even more than a century and a half after the events they describe. The ultimate lesson of Meridian Hall may be that individual acts of conscience and courage, while morally significant, were no match for the collective power of a society determined to preserve its way of life at any cost. Cornelius Langford's attempt to do right by Mercy and their son was heroic, but ultimately futile against the forces arrayed against them. Today, as visitors tour the historic mansions of Natchez and admire their architectural beauty, few pause to consider the human cost of the wealth that built them. The story of Meridian Hall serves as a necessary reminder that such beauty was purchased with suffering that extended far beyond the cotton fields to touch the most intimate aspects of human relationships. The sealed chamber beneath Meridian Hall contained not just the remains of murder victims, but also the evidence of love that defied social conventions and legal restrictions. In their willingness to risk everything for each other, Cornelius and Mercy demonstrated that human connection could transcend even the most rigid barriers imposed by society. Their story, hidden for over a century and still partially concealed today, stands as testimony to both the worst and best impulses of human nature. In the same soil that witnessed such violence and hatred, love had briefly flourished before being crushed by forces too powerful to resist. The mystery of Meridian Hall will likely never be fully resolved, as too many documents remain sealed and too many witnesses have carried their secrets to unmarked graves. However, enough evidence exists to understand that what happened there in 1838 was both a personal tragedy and a symptom of larger societal sickness that infected every aspect of antebellum life. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this case is the realization that similar stories probably played out on plantations throughout the South, leaving no trace for historians to discover. The lucky accident that preserved the evidence at Meridian Hall may represent only a tiny fraction of the violence and injustice that occurred during this period of American history. The name Meridian Hall has been forgotten by most, and the location where it stood shows no visible trace of its history. Yet the story of what happened there continues to demand recognition and remembrance, if only to honor the memory of those whose lives were cut short in the service of maintaining an immoral system. In the end, the case serves as a reminder that the past is never truly buried, and that the consequences of historical injustice continue to influence the present in ways both seen and unseen. The soil of Natchez still holds secrets that may never be fully revealed, but which continue to shape the landscape of memory and conscience for those willing to acknowledge their presence. The winds that sweep across the Mississippi bluffs carry more than river mist through the streets of modern Natchez. They carry the whispers of those whose stories were deliberately erased, whose names were struck from official records, whose graves bear no markers to acknowledge their existence. In 1868, exactly 30 years after the events at Meridian Hall, the last surviving member of Judge Crawford's delegation made a final confession to his priest. Father Michael O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who served the small Catholic community in Natchez, recorded this deathbed testimony in his private journal. The confession, discovered in 1949 among the priest's personal effects, provided the final piece of evidence needed to understand what had truly transpired on that September night in 1838. According to the dying man's account, the delegation had not intended to commit murder when they arrived at Meridian Hall. Their purpose had been to force Cornelius to abandon his plans and sell Mercy to distant buyers, thereby eliminating the threat to social order without resorting to violence. However, Cornelius had refused to consider any compromise, threatening instead to expose the similar relationships that several delegation members maintained with their own enslaved women. The confrontation escalated when Mercy herself appeared, carrying her infant son and demanding to know what was being planned for their future. Her presence in the room, her obvious education, and her bold questioning of white men created a situation that the delegation found intolerable. In their worldview, such behavior represented a fundamental challenge to the natural order that could not be permitted to continue. What followed was swift and brutal. Mercy was struck down while attempting to protect her child, who was killed moments later. Cornelius, witnessing the destruction of everything he had tried to protect, suffered what Dr. Prescott later described as a complete mental collapse. Rather than live with the knowledge of what had been done, he chose to end his own life using poison obtained from the plantation's medical supplies. The delegation then worked through the night to conceal all evidence of what had occurred. The bodies were hidden in the sealed chamber, the study was cleaned and rearranged to suggest natural death, and a story was fabricated about Mercy's escape that would satisfy both legal requirements and community curiosity. Father O'Brien's journal reveals that the dying confessor had been haunted for 30 years by nightmares of that September night. He described being unable to forget the sound of the infant's cries or the expression in Mercy's eyes as she tried to shield her child from violence. The priest noted that several other delegation members had died under mysterious circumstances in the years following 1838, suggesting that the psychological burden of their actions had proven too heavy to bear. The journal also contains Father O'Brien's own reflections on what the confession revealed about the nature of evil in human society. He wrote, "I have heard many admissions of sin in the confessional, but none that demonstrated so clearly how ordinary men can become instruments of profound evil when they believe their way of life is threatened. These were not monsters, but respected members of their community who chose violence rather than allow their world to change." In 1964, exactly 26 years after the discovery of the hidden chamber, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History received an anonymous donation that included Father O'Brien's complete journals. However, the materials were immediately classified as restricted access, and researchers were denied permission to examine them. The official explanation cited privacy concerns and the need to protect the reputations of prominent families, but historians suspected that more contemporary interests were at stake. The final chapter of the Meridian Hall mystery began to unfold in 1967, when the property was sold to developers for the subdivision project. During the demolition of the main house, workers reported finding additional hidden spaces throughout the building. These concealed rooms contained evidence of an extensive network of secret chambers and passages, suggesting that the plantation had been designed to hide activities that went far beyond a single tragic relationship. Among the items discovered were journals written by other enslaved women who had been involved with members of the Langford family over several generations. These documents revealed that the situation between Cornelius and Mercy was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a pattern of relationships that had been carefully concealed for decades. The difference was that Cornelius had attempted to formalize and legitimize what previous generations had kept hidden and exploitative. The demolition was completed hastily, with many areas of the house destroyed before they could be thoroughly examined. Workers reported that their supervisors seemed eager to finish the project quickly, offering bonus payments for rapid completion and discouraging detailed documentation of discoveries. By the time historians learned of the additional findings, all evidence had been destroyed or removed to unknown locations. The subdivision built on the Meridian Hall grounds has experienced persistent problems that real estate agents struggle to explain. Houses require frequent foundation repairs, electrical systems fail without apparent cause, and families report strange phenomena that make long-term residence difficult. The lots closest to where the main house once stood have changed hands numerous times, with most owners citing inexplicable feelings of unease that make the properties unsuitable for family life. Local folklore has begun to develop around these experiences, though residents are generally reluctant to discuss them openly. Children playing in the neighborhood sometimes report seeing figures in period clothing walking among the houses, particularly during the early morning hours when mist rises from the nearby river. These sightings are typically dismissed as imagination, but they occur with sufficient frequency to create an undercurrent of anxiety among parents. The truth about what happened at Meridian Hall in 1838 represents more than a historical curiosity or a local ghost story. It serves as a window into the mechanisms by which societies maintain oppressive systems through violence and intimidation. The willingness of respected community leaders to commit murder rather than allow social change demonstrates the lengths to which people will go to preserve their privileges and worldview. The story also illustrates how effectively such violence can be concealed when entire communities collaborate in maintaining silence. The fabricated story of Mercy's escape was accepted without serious investigation because it served everyone's interests to avoid examining the truth too closely. This conspiracy of silence proved so effective that the real story remained hidden for more than a century. Perhaps most significantly, the continued restriction of documents related to this case suggests that the forces which concealed these murders in 1838 retain influence in the present day. The fact that key evidence remains classified more than 50 years after its discovery indicates that some truths are still considered too dangerous for public knowledge. The legacy of Meridian Hall extends beyond the specific tragedy that occurred there to encompass broader questions about how societies remember and forget their most shameful episodes. The erasure of this story from public memory reflects ongoing efforts to maintain romanticized narratives about the antebellum South that cannot survive honest examination of historical evidence. For the people of Natchez, the case serves as a reminder that their beautiful city was built upon foundations of violence and exploitation that extended far beyond the cotton fields. The grand mansions that attract tourists today were not just symbols of wealth and refinement, but also centers of human suffering that touched every aspect of daily life. The sealed documents in various archives across Mississippi continue to hold secrets that might illuminate not only this case, but many others like it. Until those materials are made available to researchers, the full extent of the violence used to maintain white supremacy in the antebellum South will remain unknown. However, the fragments of truth that have emerged from Meridian Hall provide enough evidence to understand that such violence was systematic rather than exceptional. Today, as the Mississippi River continues its eternal flow past the bluffs of Natchez, it carries with it the memory of all those whose stories were deliberately erased from official records. The water that once transported the cotton, harvested by enslaved labor, now bears witness to truths that powerful interests have worked for generations to conceal. The wind that whispers through the subdivision built on Meridian Hall's ruins carries voices that demand recognition and remembrance. In a society that has officially rejected the values that created such tragedies, the persistence of these memories serves as a necessary reminder that the past is never truly buried, and that the consequences of historical injustice continue to shape the present in ways both seen and unseen. The mystery of Meridian Hall may never be fully resolved, but its partial revelation has already accomplished something significant. It has demonstrated that the romantic mythology of the Old South cannot withstand honest examination of the documentary evidence. Behind the facade of gracious living and noble traditions lay a reality of systematic oppression that extended into the most intimate aspects of human relationships. The story of Cornelius Langford, Mercy, and their unnamed son stands as testimony to both the possibility of love transcending social barriers and the terrible price paid by those who dared to challenge an immoral system. Their tragedy, hidden for so long and still partially concealed today, serves as a monument to all those whose lives were sacrificed to maintain a way of life that should never have been permitted to exist. In the end, the soil of Natchez holds more secrets than will ever be fully revealed, but each fragment of truth that emerges serves to honor the memory of those whose suffering was deemed acceptable by their contemporaries. The continuing struggle to uncover and acknowledge these stories represents a necessary act of historical justice, even when it comes more than a century too late. The case of Meridian Hall reminds us that the past exerts its influence on the present in ways that transcend official records and public monuments. The truth has a persistence that outlasts the efforts of those who would suppress it, and memory has a power that cannot be entirely eliminated by violence or silence. As the sun sets over the Mississippi River and darkness falls across the bluffs of Natchez, the story of what happened at Meridian Hall in 1838 continues to demand recognition. It speaks for all those whose names were struck from the records, whose graves bear no markers, whose stories were deliberately erased, but whose memory refuses to be silenced. The mystery endures, partially solved but never fully resolved, a reminder that some truths are too powerful to remain buried forever, no matter how determined the efforts to conceal them may be.